They appeared in local news bulletins every few years, short notes about missing persons. Tourists, thrill seekers, tramps. They all had one thing in common: they were last seen near an old cemetery on the outskirts of a remote forest. Locals whispered that the land there was unclean, but the real nightmare had nothing to do with ghosts. The cemetery appeared at the end of the 19th century as a temporary shelter for victims of an epidemic that wiped out workers from a nearby factory. The graves were dug hastily, without names, crosses or fences. When the disease receded, the site was abandoned, and after a couple of decades it was completely forgotten. By the 1950s, the area was overgrown with thorny bushes, and the ground had sunk, exposing rotting coffins. The local authorities put up a rusty fence with a sign saying, "Private property," but that didn't stop vandals, drug addicts, and curious teenagers. In 1987, a forester checking wild boar traps came across the body of a man. The corpse was lying in a pit, covered with lime, with a slit throat. The investigation stalled because the victim had no identification, and there were no cameras in the area. A year later, a couple of students who were collecting material for a course on abandoned cemeteries disappeared in the same way. Their backpacks were found at the entrance, and inside there was a dictaphone with 3 minutes of recording, screams, muffled thuds, and someone's heavy breathing. The police attributed the cases to unidentified criminals, but residents of the nearest village swore that they heard footsteps at night, as if someone was dragging heavy bags on the ground. Laura didn't believe in urban legends. At 24, she was into trash tourism, sneaking into abandoned factories, climbing into drainage tunnels, and then posting videos on YouTube. The cemetery seemed to be an ideal location: gloomy, atmospheric, safe. She took with her a cameraman friend, Mark, and a drone for panoramic filming. For the first 2 hours, nothing foreshadowed trouble. They took down dilapidated crypts, sunken graves, and a flock of crows circling the trees. While Mark was changing the battery in the camera, Laura decided to explore the far corner of the cemetery. There, behind a pile of rocks, she noticed a trapdoor, iron, covered with a layer of dirt, but clearly modern. The handle was welded, but the rust made the metal brittle. Hitting the crowbar, she opened the passage. A staircase led down, smelling of damp and chemicals. The flashlight picked out concrete walls, overhead wires, and plastic cans. There were empty syringes, pieces of duct tape, and gloves with brown stains on the floor. Laura was about to call the police when she noticed a door with a combination lock. There was a groan behind her. Mark, who came down after her, tried to persuade her to leave, but Laura turned on the live broadcast. "Guys, this is not a joke, there's someone here," she whispered into the camera. Viewers will later tell how a shadow flashed behind her back, and the sound abruptly stopped. The police examined the recording and found an underground laboratory. The walls of the room were covered with polyethylene, on the tables were equipment for the production of methamphetamine, and in the corner, cells. 3 cages, as if for large dogs, with chains and bowls for water. In one of them lay the corpse of a man in torn clothes, his face disfigured by chemical burns. The examination showed that he died the day before the arrival of the group. But the scariest thing was found in the next room. There was a calendar on the wall with dates matching the disappearances over the past 5 years. Next to it is a notebook with notes. Number 12, too weak, could not withstand the dose. Number 15, tried to escape, disposed of in the mine. The last entry read, Number 23 is a female blogger. Surveillance is possible. Prepare for relocation. Laura and Mark were never found. A month later, their drone was found in the forest. There were 3 seconds of shaky recordings on the memory card. Laura, pinned to the ground by someone's hand in a black glove, and a voiceover, "You ruined my perfect place." The woods around the cemetery were cordoned off for 3 weeks. The police searched every meter of the underground laboratory, seizing kilograms of drugs, homemade weapons, and folders with photographs. Hundreds of pictures, men, women, teenagers, all with numbers on their chests, like cattle for slaughter. Some were identified from missing persons databases. Others have remained nameless statistics. Investigators assumed that the criminals had been using the cemetery as a shelter for years. They buried industrial waste in old graves, and turned tourists into experimental subjects for testing new methamphetamine formulas. The survivors were sold into slavery or forced to work in a laboratory. But the leader remained in the shadows. The only clue is the voice from the drone recording. The linguists noted a slight accent, possibly Eastern European, and a strange slip of the tongue, the perfect place. It became clear that this was not just a drug lab. In the notebooks, they found diagrams of tunnels going deep into the forest. The engineers determined that part of the tunnels led to abandoned mines where shale was mined in the middle of the 20th century. The criminals turned them into a system of traps, pits with stakes, weights suspended over precipices, carbon monoxide chambers. That explained why no one had escaped. Meanwhile, a quiet panic began in the town. A local pharmacist, Jacob Rayner, disappeared 2 days after the lab was discovered. A note was found in his house, "They know what I saw." It turned out that Jacob had been supplying painkillers to pharmacies for years, and shipping some of the prescriptions to the cemetery. His computer was hacked, and his last search query was, "How to delete GPS history." The surviving victims, those who had been found, refused to speak. One guy, with his face disfigured by acid, was in a mental hospital for a week, muttering, "He comes in his sleep, says I'm part of the system now." The nurses thought it was nonsense until a plumber came into the room with a bag of tools. After his visit, the patient fell silent forever. The doctors diagnosed a stroke, but the camera in the hallway recorded a stab in the neck. Laura woke up in total darkness, with a rag bag over her head. His arms are twisted behind his back, and his mouth tastes of blood and gasoline. Mark was wheezing nearby. They pulled out 2 of my teeth. They say it's for your stream. They were kept in a hole dug under the garage. Every few hours, a bucket of water and dog food were lowered from above. The guard, a boy of about 18 with a tattoo of number 8 on his wrist, once blabbed, "The boss likes those who resist. You are now models for new experiments." They were moved a week later. Laura remembered the sound of the truck engine, the cries of seagulls and the smell of fish. Then there was a cold wind, the creak of metal and footsteps on gravel. When the bag was removed, she saw an abandoned drilling rig in the sea, covered with seagulls. Downstairs, people in handcuffs lived in rusty containers. Some were cleaning fish, others were assembling some kind of devices. "Welcome to the factory," the man with the burned hands whispered. "They make bombs here. And those who don't work well are sent to the bottom." She didn't know which was worse, the daily humiliation, the endurance tests with new drugs, or the fact that at night someone inserted a flash drive with her old videos into her camera. In one of them, recorded a year before, she laughed, standing on the edge of the drainage tunnel, "I feel immortal." The drilling rig looked like a giant rusty spider, digging its paws into the seabed. Waves crashed against the metal supports, salt water corroded the wounds on Laura's wrists. She was forced to work in a narrow hold that smelled of fuel oil and decomposing fish. Together with a dozen other prisoners, she collected improvised explosives, TNT sticks wrapped with nails and wires. "For terrorist attacks," explained a thin man with scars instead of ears. "Or for blackmail. The boss likes options." Mark was transferred to another part of the tower. Laura saw him only once a day, when the guards dropped them off in a shared cell for a smoke break. His face was gray, and his eyes were shifty, like those of a hunted animal. "They're injecting me with something. It's new every day," he whispered, while the guards smoked at the hatch. "They say if I survive, I'll become an improved version." Attempts at rebellion were quickly suppressed. When a guy from Brazil hit a guard with a wrench, he was tied to a winch and slowly lowered into the water. The cameras captured crabs plastering his face, and seagulls pecking out his eyes. The video was shown to everyone at dinner. "Study," the guard said, clicking the remote control from the projector. "Or you'll become fodder." Laura noticed that some of the prisoners were resigned. A woman in her 40s, a former teacher, was now soldering detonators perfectly. "I do them with marriage," she confessed one day. "I hope they explode in the hands of these bastards." But more often people broke down. The teenager, whose name was number 31, cut his forearms with a nail every night until he was discovered and chained to a pipe for starvation rations. Salvation came from a place that was not expected. Guard number 8, the boy with the tattoo, started tossing pieces of cards to Laura. Patrol routes, shift schedules, and camera blind spots were drawn on scraps of paper. "They killed my sister," he wrote on the back of the cafeteria menu. "Help me, and I'll blow this shit up." The plan took a week to mature. Number 8 had to turn off the generator during the night shift. Laura and Mark, along with 3 other prisoners, would have made their way to the lifeboats. The teacher volunteered to mine the diesel warehouse, to burn like hell. But an hour before the escape, Mark was gone. He was found in the toilet with empty syringes in his hands. His eyes were open, and blood was foaming from his mouth. "Overdose," the guard announced, dragging the body across the floor. "Who's next?" Laura almost lost her temper, but number 8 grabbed her hand. "If we don't leave now, we'll all die." The generator shut down at 2:14. The guards rushed to the control panel, not noticing how the prisoners slipped out through the ventilation hatch. They ran along the narrow catwalks, clinging to the handrails, tearing their skin off against the rust. Shots rang out from behind as the teacher activated the bomb. A fireball engulfed the central platform, illuminating the night sea. There was no boat. Number 8, bleeding from a bullet wound in his side, pointed to a dark dot in the distance. "There's a fishing boat. They come for cargo once a month. We'll get there by swimming." Laura jumped into the icy water last. The current dragged him down, and his wounds burned with salt. She swam, following the cries of seagulls, until her hands came across a net. The fisherman pulled her out, cursing in an incomprehensible language. When she whispered, "Police," the oldest pulled out a knife, but then number 8 emerged from the water. His face was blue, and his fingers were clutching a grenade without a pin. "Take us, or I'll blow up your hold," he wheezed. The ship turned towards the shore. Laura, wrapped in a dirty blanket, watched the drilling rig turn into a sparkling dot on the horizon. Number 8 died in her arms 2 hours later. In the pocket of his jacket, she found a photo of him and a teenage girl who looked like him standing at the entrance to the zoo. On the back is an inscription, "Come back alive, idiot." The fishermen landed them at the port, which was even marked on maps as a private territory. The docks were deserted except for cranes with peeling paint and a barge piled high with rusty barrels. The older one, with a face scarred by nets, demanded that Laura give everything she had. She held out a picture of number 8 and his sister. The man froze, looked at the boy's corpse lying in a pool of fuel oil, and spat, "Get out. And if you get caught, you didn't know me." They walked along the shore all night. Laura stumbled over the rocks, her torn jacket chafing her neck. Explosions were still ringing in my ears, and fiery glare was dancing in front of my eyes. By morning, they reached the abandoned lighthouse. The interior smelled of mold and gasoline. There were empty cans of stew on the floor, spent shell casings, and tubes of medicines that had expired 10 years ago. They found a walkie-talkie in the corner, ancient but working. His first attempt to contact the police was almost his last. The voice on the speaker, introducing himself as a sergeant, asked for their coordinates. Laura had already opened her mouth when the teacher pulled out the microphone. He lied. Real cops would have asked for the password. It turned out that a year earlier, one of the prisoners from the tower had tried to call for help. He was found hanged with the same radio around his neck. The plan was born out of desperation. The teacher, whose name was Elaine, remembered about the flash drive with the video that was thrown into Laura's camera. "They're monitoring your channel," she said. "So they can follow your social media." Laura took out a wet phone from her pocket, which had miraculously survived in a plastic bag. The battery was at 3%, but she managed to log into the cloud. There, among the old videos, there was a video from the cemetery, the underground laboratory, the calendar with dates, the notebook. She posted it to a private account that only her younger brother had access to, with the caption, "If I'm gone, give it to the FBI." An hour later, the phone picked up a weak signal. A text message came, "Little sister, are you alive?" Laura managed to write, "Yes," before the screen went blank. The shelter was opened at dawn. The first alarm was given by the cry of seagulls. They darted over the lighthouse, as if sensing danger. Elaine looked out the window. 3 men in black were walking along the beach, with dogs on leashes. "They're on the trail," she whispered. "We need to get to the highway." We ran through the pine forest, branches slapping our faces. Laura was carrying a wounded Elaine on her back, who had stepped on a trap, a bear trap covered with leaves. The bones hadn't broken, but the rusty teeth had punctured the muscles. "Leave me alone," the woman wheezed. "Get to the trucks on Highway 95. Drivers sometimes give me a ride." Laura was silent. She had already lost Mark and number 8, she couldn't leave another one. They climbed out onto the asphalt and crawled to the curb. The first truck stopped. The driver, a bearded man in a cowboy hat, leaned out the window. Laura wanted to shout, "Yes," but Elaine grabbed her arm. "You can't," she whispered. "Look at his boots." The leather boots were as clean as new, even though the road was covered in mud. This is not the case with truckers. They refused. The driver left, but returned 5 minutes later with reinforcements. 2 SUVs cut off their path to the forest. Masked men got out of the cars. One of them was holding a tranquilizer gun for large animals. Laura turned to run and saw a school bus on the road. Yellow, with cracked windows, but moving at full speed. She jumped out into the middle of the highway, waving her arms. The brakes howled, and the bus spun across the road. Teenagers in tracksuits poured out of the door, the basketball team, judging by the inscriptions on the backpacks. "Hey, what's going on here?" The coach, a man under 2 meters tall, shouted. The masked men hesitated. Laura did not remember how she got on the bus, how the coach gave her a bottle of water and called an ambulance on the radio. Elaine was losing consciousness, but managed to whisper, "Don't tell them the truth. Tell them that we ran away from our rapist husband." The ambulance arrived 40 minutes later. The orderlies, bored guys in their 20s, didn't even ask for names. "Just another homeless man with an overdose," one of them snorted, hoisting Elaine onto a stretcher. Laura pretended to be asleep. She heard the dispatcher's radio saying, "A girl with red hair, about 25. Take him to the hospital on Vine Street." She jumped up as the bus turned onto the exit ramp to the city. She knocked out the window with her fists and jumped into the bushes. The last thing she saw was Elaine looking at her from the stretcher. The woman raised her hand, showing 3 fingers, "Wait 3 days." Laura lay in the manhole for 2 days, clutching the phone stolen from the bus to her chest. On the 3rd morning, exactly 72 hours after jumping from the ambulance, she ventured out. The city park was empty, except for a stray dog rummaging through the trash. She turned on her phone, and her brother's new Twitter account glowed with a notification, "The authorities have the video. Wait for help." But help came from the wrong side. The first to appear were teenagers on bicycles, ordinary boys in caps, until one of them pulled out a pistol with a silencer. Laura started to run, but her leg was cramped. A bullet pierced her shoulder as she stumbled over tree roots. The second shot hit him in the stomach. She fell face first into the mud, feeling the warmth spreading under her jacket. "Don't kill me right away," said the voice above her. "The boss wants to talk." She was loaded into a van marked "Pizza Delivery." It smelled of bleach and blood inside. Across from him sat a man in a suit, with his face covered by an anonymous mask from internet memes. The voice was soft, almost paternal. "You ruined my rig, Laura. Burned tons of equipment. She killed my people. But I admire your audacity. Therefore, I will give you a choice." He handed her 2 syringes. "Red is adrenaline with a neurotoxin. You'll die in a minute, but you'll feel every cell. Blue is an experimental stimulant. If you survive, you'll be a better person. Like Mark." Laura spat into his mask. "I choose the third option." The man laughed. "Your brother is already on the bus. With 4 kilograms of explosives in his backpack. If you don't call him in an hour, he'll die a hero." The phone in Laura's pocket vibrated. On the screen is my brother's face pressed against the window of a moving bus. Behind him are children in school uniforms. "Well, blogger," said the masked man, "do you still want to be a hero?"